I think that's 5. Good evening, everyone. We are so glad that you're here and that you've come to hear the first of our speaker series event. I have the pleasure of introducing our college president, Dr. Georgia Lorenz, who is going to say a few words, and then we'll get started.
Good evening. First, I would like to know how many of you are not students or employees of the college? Hi, Paul. Welcome to those of you who are from our community. Thank you very much for coming to Seminole State College tonight for this special event. And I want to thank the committee who puts the speaker series together every year. I think this is a really important opportunity for us. As the students in the audience and the faculty will tell those of you from our external community, we really try to promote critical thinking and lifelong learning as values that are very important here at the college. And I think our speaker series gives us the opportunity to extend that to our larger community. So welcome to Seminole State College. Thank you for being here. I hope that you can find many more opportunities to get connected with us through our planetarium speaker series, our arts events, and many other opportunities. So thank you very much and enjoy the speaker.
I have students in the audience, so this is wonderful. So I'm getting the applause, ready to give a U.S. federal government lecture. Good evening. Again, thanks for coming out. It's great to have such an intimate crowd to have a good discussion about politics. I'm Tracy Harbin. I teach political science at the college. I've also served on the speaker series committee for a number of years. And so every year we start talking about the opportunities that we have to bring in speakers. And so since this is an election year, albeit the midterm elections, it's still an election year, we thought it would be a great time to talk politics. And so those of you who are my students, and you got a sense from some of that applause, they are getting extra credit for being here. I might have to increase that with that applause. But we've been talking this week about political parties, and we've been talking about the Democrats and Republicans and trying to understand what makes for a good Democrat and what makes for a good Republican. And it's a time in American politics where we as a nation are really divided between the left and the right. We see our friends and families maybe voting differently than what they have in the past. We've also seen the political parties kind of scrambling to capture those voters, to show that they serve the interests. So whether you were for Hillary or not, she still was trying to galvanize the women's vote. When we look at Sarah Palin with the VP nomination to John McCain's run, we talked about those hockey moms. Political scientists like to talk about the soccer moms, the mountain transplants. We're constantly thinking about groups of people who maybe aren't as engaged in politics, or maybe they're not as represented. And we've reached a time in America where it's really about the working class. We talk about the middle class, who's looking out for them. Part of Trump's success as we watch over these last 2 years is really speaking to that working class and really rallying his base to get the support to perhaps for some of us shockingly win the Republican nomination. My students have heard me talk about this probably ad nauseum, but we've talked about it a lot because he changed kind of the field of Republican politics. And it's a question of why and how. And now we've reached a time at the midterms where we're really thinking about, is he going to be able to keep the unified government that he has, Republican control of the House and the Senate? And I don't want to take away too much from Mr. Douthit's talk, but it is that question. And the working class, again, are kind of asking who's looking out for us, because as we started watching some of the trade agreements, we're seeing that it doesn't benefit all. So what might be good for the steel workers may not be so good for the farmers, and vice versa. So it's a complicated time. It's a great time to be talking politics. With that being said, it's not my lecture, so I won't keep you any further. Let me introduce Mr. Douthit. I can keep going. It's very exciting. Like, I have an audience and I don't have to grade them. Like, this is the best type of teaching there is. So Ross Douthat joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in 2009. And I know some of you have been conditioned to think, New York Times, that's the most liberal paper there is. But the New York Times, like any good kind of intellectual paper, looks at both the liberal and conservative viewpoints. So they brought Mr. Douthat on. Prior to that post, he was a senior editor at The Atlantic, and he's also a blogger for theatlantic.com. He's author of the book Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and he also wrote a book called Privileged, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. And again, I would encourage you, even though our talk tonight will not center on that, have a look at the book, have a look at the blogs. I've looked at your blog work, and it's fascinating to me. You cover so many different topics week by week by week that I'm in awe, really. But the book we have asked him to talk about is a co-authored piece called The Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. In that book, he challenges, along with his co-author, the conventional wisdom and called upon the grand old party to focus on the interests and needs of the working class voters. This book laid bare the failures of the conservative revolution, and it also presented a detailed blueprint for building the next Republican majority. Tonight, Ross will discuss the current state of the Republican politics and provide an updated viewpoint on how they can maintain a popular support. Please welcome me in joining. Please join me. I can do this, guys. I'm not a scripted person. Please come on stage. I've set you up.
Thank you so much for that incredibly kind and informative introduction, which I could have listened to honestly all night. It's better when you're the speaker, you know, to condense your own time and let someone else talk. It's always a wise course. But I'm so grateful to Seminole State for having me. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. For those of you who aren't getting official extra credit for being here, know that you get extra credit in my heart, which is, you know, just as good. So I'm going to try and talk tonight basically about a pretty small topic, the last 75 years or so of American political history. No big deal. And try and give an account that will hopefully be somewhat helpful in figuring out how we got where we are today. Where Donald Trump came from, where the current Republican coalition came from, what its vulnerabilities are, some ways of thinking about what might or might not happen next Tuesday, all of that kind of stuff. But I think the best place to start is with the title that we ended up choosing for this lecture, which is, Can the Republican Party Keep the Working Class? And it's a good place to start because if you got in a political time machine, or really any time machine, I don't know what a political time machine is, just a time machine, and went back to American politics in, say, 1945 or 1950 or 1955, basically any period after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president and after the New Deal, and you asked that question, nobody would know what you were talking about. They would say, can Republicans keep the working class? Well, first they would have to win it, right? The working class is understood as a Democratic constituency. The Democratic Party is the party of American workers who are in unions. It's the party of blue-collar factory workers. It's the party of the industrial Midwest. It's the party of everything, basically, that you would associate in the years after World War II with the working class, with sort of wage-earning Americans, with Americans who don't have fancy college degrees, with Americans who had suffered tremendously in the Great Depression, and who had ended up supporting the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was seen as having basically been on their side and built a kind of safety net that they tended to believe in. So American politics after World War II was defined by a Democratic Party majority that was built on broad-scale support from working-class Americans. And pan-ethnic support from working-class Americans, meaning that it wasn't just white Americans, white working-class Americans who supported the Democratic Party in those days. It was working-class black Americans. You know, at that point, Italian American identity or Irish American identity was probably more important than it is today, as important as, you know, pizza and Irish pubs still are to America. Those ethnic identities have sort of blurred more into a general whiteness than they had 50 or 60 years ago. But basically, whatever ethnicity, whatever race, whatever background you were, if you were a working class American or thought of yourself as a working class American, there was a good chance that you supported the Democratic Party and saw the Republican Party as the party of businessmen, bosses, the upper middle class, and sometimes the rich. So that was American politics 50 or 60 years ago. So what changed? Well, a bunch of things changed, but basically in the 1960s and 1970s, that Democratic coalition, which basically said, we're going to have a government that looks out for you, that sort of, you know, builds a safety net to protect you, that provides for Social Security, that does the GI Bill so that, you know, people can go to college after World War II. All of these things, that Democratic coalition entered into a kind of crisis. And it entered into crisis for a bunch of reasons. In part, all of American society entered into crisis in the 1960s and 1970s. Crime rates went way up. There was the divorce revolution, basically, where divorce rates went way, way up, and family breakdown and single parenthood and all of these things became realities in American life in a way that they hadn't been 20 or 30 years before. The Vietnam War happened and basically divided American society as never before over foreign policy. You had urban riots in the aftermath of the Civil Rights era that divided America along racial lines, along urban-rural lines. All of these things happened, and all of these things basically created new cleavages within the Democratic coalition that hadn't been there before. And over that same period, the working class, this, again, very broad category of Americans, had become more prosperous than it had been in the 1930s and 1940s, more secure, and began to think of itself as a kind of tax-paying class, not just as a class that was getting things from the government, but as a class that was paying for things out of its own pocketbook. And so it became much more tax-sensitive than it had been before. And working class Americans began voting more and more on the basis of the idea that they were paying for government programs and weren't getting a lot out of them. And over the same period, too, you had for the first time a kind of large-scale secularization in American life, where church-going rates declined, Christian churches especially got into heated internal arguments about the sexual revolution, about divorce and birth control, and then abortion, and then later homosexuality. And that, for the first time, created this gap between where a big part of the Democratic Party was and where a lot of more religious and culturally conservative working class voters were. So the sort of leadership of the Democratic Party, a large part of its sort of intellectual supporters and so on, became much more socially liberal than they had been in the 1940s and 1950s. If you went back to the 1940s and 1950s and listened to how Democratic politicians talked about religion, family, sex, all of those kind of things, they would have sounded basically like we think of Republican politicians sounding today. There was this pretty sturdy, socially conservative religious consensus in America in the 1940s and 1950s that cracked up in a big way in the 60s and 70s. And so you have all of these fault lines happening. And then you have fault lines, obviously, which I already mentioned, around race, where you have the civil rights movement happens, and basically there's a kind of large-scale national consensus that the civil rights acts, the stuff that passes under Lyndon Johnson in the early 1960s, are a good idea. And when the Republican Party in the early 1960s nominates Barry Goldwater, who basically defends sort of southern states' rights to discriminate against black people, to sort of put it in the crudest possible terms, Goldwater ends up losing in a massive landslide. He wins some states in the Deep South. He doesn't win anywhere else. There's a kind of large-scale political repudiation of resistance to the Civil Rights Acts. But then, when the next phase of the Civil Rights Movement happens, when you go from debates about the right to vote and segregation to debates about affirmative action, or debates about school busing, where black kids are being bused out of inner city areas into often working-class white neighborhoods that have somewhat better schools, suddenly there isn't this kind of national consensus that just isolates the Deep South. There are huge divisions all over the country, in the North as well as the South. And again, those divisions sort of split a big part of the white working class away from the Democratic Party. So white working class voters who are happy to vote for the Party of Civil Rights when civil rights meant letting black people vote in Mississippi suddenly don't want to vote for the Democratic Party when civil rights means busing their kids to a majority black school, busing black kids to their schools, basically sort of, crossing the lines of neighborhood and the lines of race, and doing so, based on court orders handed down from Washington, D.C., or handed down by judges who send their own kids to private schools and don't seem to have any skin in the game. And so that, too, creates a tension between a big swath here of just the white working class and the Democratic Party. And the way American politics works, basically, is when you have a fault line in one political coalition, the other political party moves to exploit it. And that's what the Republican Party did, again, from the 1960s, especially the late 1960s onward. It picked up on all of these issues where a chunk of the working class was increasingly alienated from the Democratic Party and said, hey, we're here to answer your concerns. We're here to get you to vote for us. And that took a lot of different forms. It meant a strong emphasis on patriotism and religion and family values. It meant a strong emphasis on being really, really tough on crime. And remember, crime in America in the 1960s and 70s skyrocketed in levels that, seem implausible if you look back on them. The cities seemed ungovernable, and the liberal political coalition governing cities seemed to have no idea how to deal with rising crime rates. And into this landscape, you get politicians like Richard Nixon basically saying, well, you have to be tough on crime, you have to increase spending on cops, you have to toughen sentencing, you have to do all of these kind of things that the Democratic coalition in the 60s had thought were sort of out of date and too harsh, and you didn't really need to do that kind of thing anymore. So Republicans ran on crime, they ran on some kind of traditional moral values, and they ran on taxes. They said, look, if you look at the tax brackets we have, they aren't even indexed to inflation. So as inflation makes your income rise, even though you're not necessarily making more money because it's just being inflated, and there was a lot of inflation in the 1970s, you're moving into a higher and higher tax bracket, even though you're still basically middle class or lower middle class, and you feel like you're living paycheck to paycheck and the government's taking more and more of your money. We're going to stop that. We're going to cut taxes. And so there ended up being a sort of large-scale Republican messaging effort under Richard Nixon and then under Ronald Reagan that was very successful in presidential elections at getting a large number of especially white Americans who didn't have college degrees, who were often blue-collar workers who had voted for Democrats in most elections, to suddenly start voting for Republicans. And that was the basis of basically the political realignment that happened in American politics between 1968, when Richard Nixon narrowly won the presidential election with a third-party candidate, George Wallace, and 1984, when Ronald Reagan was reelected in this huge, sweeping landslide. It was that realignment was based on getting working-class voters, and mostly white working-class voters, because race was one of these lines of fracture, to vote more for Republicans than they ever would have imagined doing, certainly during the New Deal era, but even down into the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s. But there were limits to that realignment, because the Republican Party remained, in economic policy, seen as more of the party of the rich, more the party of business than the party of the working class. So you had a lot of working class voters who would, for instance, vote for Republicans for president, vote for Richard Nixon, vote for Ronald Reagan, but then continue to vote for their local Democratic congressman or senator. And the term that got thrown around for these voters in the early 1980s was Reagan Democrats, right? They would often, they were sort of stereotypically in somewhere like Macomb County, Michigan, right? And they would be the children and grandchildren of unionized workers who had worked for Ford or Chrysler and so on, who were making $40,000 or $50,000 a year at this point, and had always voted for Democrats, and now they were voting for Reagan, but they still were voting for Democrats for Congress, and they had sort of embraced Republican economic policy to the extent that it promised to cut their own taxes, but they didn't agree with Republicans when Republicans, let's say, said we need to reform Medicare or Social Security. We need to cut spending on social programs. These voters thought of those social programs as an important part of their lives, an important part of their stability, an important part of the safety net. And so they basically, that combination gave us what has become sort of the default Republican approach to policymaking. When you elect a Republican, Republicans come in and they say, we're going to cut taxes and we're going to cut government spending. We're going to cut taxes and then we're going to shrink the government at the same time. But in fact, what Republicans do is that they cut taxes and they don't cut government spending. And they do that, for a lot of reasons, but primarily because a big chunk of their coalition still likes at least some government programs, especially the biggest and most expensive ones, our entitlement system, and doesn't want the political party that they vote for to cut those programs. So that's what happened in certain respects under Nixon, but very much so under Ronald Reagan, and it's what in certain ways continued to happen down through George W. Bush. So in a sense, from the 1970s onward, the white working class became this kind of swing coalition, this sort of swing constituency, this piece of, and it was a big piece of American political demographics that would vote for Republicans for president but not for Congress, or it would vote for Republicans for Congress one year, and then if they seemed to be getting close to cutting Medicare or Medicaid or education spending, the way Newt Gingrich's Republicans seemed to be close to doing in the mid-1990s, then those voters would swing back to the Democrats again. And they basically created what you might call this kind of unfinished realignment, where the Republican Party could almost recreate the majorities that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson had enjoyed. But because its economic message ultimately wasn't that popular among these voters, because it was winning these voters on the basis of fears about crime, or fears about sort of social breakdown, fears about secularization, all of these sort of social and cultural issues rather than just economic policy alone, it couldn't necessarily hold them election to election, and they would swing back to Democrats reliably again and again and again. And then the Republican Party became kind of a victim of its own success. So it had won a lot of these voters on the basis of basically this sense that sort of American society had gone into free fall in the 60s and 70s. But then American society seemed to stabilize, and crime rates from the early 1990s onwards started to fall and ultimately fell dramatically, so that crime rates today are not quite as low, but almost as low as they were in the 1950s and early 1960s. A lot of the programs that Republicans had criticized for being wasteful or for subsidizing poverty or for subsidizing teen pregnancy and so on, a lot of welfare programs that were put into place in the late 1960s by Democrats ended up getting reformed. And in the end, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich together passed a big welfare reform in the mid-1990s that at least at the time was very popular, but also meant that that issue was sort of taken off the table for Republicans. So crime was falling, welfare had been reformed. We haven't talked a lot about foreign policy, but foreign policy obviously mattered in this world as well. You had a lot of working class Democrats who were very patriotic, who had supported the Vietnam War, who felt like the Democrats had moved to the left in the 60s and 70s on foreign policy, who felt that the Soviet Union was getting too powerful in the late 1970s, and they voted for Ronald Reagan and Republicans because of it. And the Cold War ended. America won, in some sense. We're still figuring out how much. But the Cold War ended and America won. And so again, Republicans could say, look, you elected us to fight communism and win the Cold War, and we did. But the nature of politics is that when you do what you promised, voters say, okay, great, now I don't have to vote for you anymore. So you had this scenario where these issues, these cultural and social issues and foreign policy issues that had helped build Republican support among working class voters were being taken off the table. And then at the same time, the tax issue also became less salient, right? So when Republicans came in the late 1970s and said, we're going to cut your taxes, the top marginal tax rate was 70, 75%. And middle class people were paying 50% of their income in taxes and so on. If you do the Reagan tax cuts, and there were tax cuts before Reagan, and then you do the tax cuts under George W. Bush later, suddenly working class Americans just aren't paying that much money in federal income taxes anymore. So they don't find the tax issue to be a reason to vote Republican. They don't want Democrats to raise their taxes again, which is why you will never hear a Democratic politician do what Walter Mondale did in 1984 and say that he's going to raise middle class taxes. Democrats have learned their lesson on that front. But the Republican promise to say, hi, Mr. Middle America making $50,000 a year, I'm going to cut your federal income tax. Mr. Middle America looks at his tax return these days and says, well, I'm paying payroll taxes for Social Security, and I'm paying sales tax and state and local taxes, but I'm not really paying that much in federal income tax anymore. So why is that a big reason to vote for Republicans? And while all of this was happening, that wave of secularization, the decline of institutional religion, the wars within institutional religion over how to deal with the sexual revolution, all of that had continued. And so American society was less religious by, let's say, the year 2000 than it had been in the year 1965 or 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected and so on. And so social and cultural conservatism, while they were still a really important force in American life, were also a somewhat weaker thing holding this working class constituency in the Republican Party. So that's sort of the landscape of, let's say, 15 years ago, when George W. Bush is just starting out as president, basically. That the Republican Party had won these voters with a set of promises. It had sort of kept a lot of those promises, but in keeping them, it had created a situation where working class America had fewer reasons to actually vote for Republicans and seemed to be swinging back to the left a little bit on economic issues, because things like the cost of health care were becoming much more important issues. And the Republican Party didn't seem to have a lot to say about that. The sort of education was a huge concern for voters, and the Republican Party had some ideas but wasn't that comfortable talking about those issues. So this is where George W. Bush comes in. George W. Bush comes in and says, okay, we've got a problem here. We can't just be the anti-government party because the votes aren't there for that. We need to hold on to the Reagan Democrats. We need to hold on to these voters who swung into our coalition for Nixon and Reagan, and to some extent for Gingrich in the early 1990s. And that's where basically Bush comes up with sort of two broad ideas that sort of overlap. One is compassionate conservatism, right? This idea that we're not going to be the mean kind of conservative, we're going to be the nice kind of conservative, we're going to care about the poor, we're going to, work with faith-based initiatives and private charities and create public-private partnerships and all of these things. And at the same time, we're going to do things like create a new prescription drugs benefit for Medicare, which was a big issue in the early 2000s. We're going to be willing to basically bid against the Democrats and say, we're willing to spend money too. We're willing to help the poor, but also to sort of help middle and working class Americans who are feeling anxious as they get close to retirement about how they're going to pay their medical bills, that kind of thing. And joined to that was something that Bush called the ownership society, which was this idea that you could build this kind of foundation for limited government conservatism among working class Americans if you could help them build assets of their own, right? Help increase home ownership, help bring working class Hispanics who were not voting for Republicans in large numbers into the Republican coalition by helping them become homeowners, helping people build assets in the stock market by encouraging not just sort of upper middle class investors, but ordinary Americans to become investors, to sort of participate in what back then was seen as this very reliable way to increase your savings, just invest in the stock market. And so the theory was that this was the way to solve this dilemma, right? You have the Republican Party, which is, supposed to be the party of limited government, the party of not spending too much, but you have a big part of the Republican coalition that seems to depend and rely on these government programs. And so we're going to build independence for those voters. So they're in charge of their own retirements, in charge of their own savings, and they don't need government spending quite as much. That was the theory. And it was a plausible theory in many ways. The people around George W. Bush, I think, understood the core dilemma of Republican politics, the fact that you had these voters you needed to hold and you didn't have a clear way to hold them, and they were trying to hold on to them. Unfortunately, the Bush presidency turned out to be basically a total disaster by the end. And some of the disaster didn't have to do with these economic issues. It had to do with foreign policy and the Iraq War going badly and there not being weapons of mass destruction and all the rest. But that hurt Republican voters. That hurt the Republican Party with working class voters because, the party had been seen as like the party you could trust on foreign policy, right? The party that won the Cold War, the party that won the first Iraq War, all of these things. And suddenly it had created basically its own version of Vietnam, its own quagmire in the Middle East. And a lot of the voters in this broad working class bloc were people who had kids or grandkids who were going off to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan and coming back wounded or just sort of disillusioned by the experience of these overseas wars. So that hurt Republicans with this constituency. And so did obviously the fact that the ownership society and the idea that you're going to pump up home ownership and pump up stock market investments for working class America. All of that collided with 2008. The housing bubble burst, and suddenly pumping up home ownership led to foreclosures and mountains of debt, and pumping up stock market investment led to huge stock market losses. And so there was this sort of collapse, basically. And that collapse, most people thought, ended this long period of Republican dominance. Barack Obama was elected president. He did very well, even with white working class voters, certainly with all working class voters. Democrats ended up with 60 seats in the Senate, lots of, a House majority, and people thought that, at the time, there were tons of articles written about the end of the Republican majority, the end of conservatism even, and the beginning of a new liberal era. But the new liberal era ran into its own problems. The Obama administration basically decided before the economy had fully recovered to push through a big health care bill that, in fact, helped a lot of working class people, but also asked a lot of more prosperous working and middle class people to subsidize other people's health insurance at a time when everybody was struggling, and that became extremely unpopular, and the law itself became unpopular. Democrats lost the House in 2010. The Obama administration basically became stalemated with Republicans in Congress and ended up fighting a lot of sort of bitter culture war battles over guns and religious liberty and immigration that alienated a lot of voters who had voted for Obama in 2008. And so but then in 2012, the Republicans nominated not a sort of self-conscious tribune of the working class. They nominated Mitt Romney, who is an incredibly decent human being, an admirable person in many ways, but not the person you would nominate for president if you were trying to build or hold a political majority that requires lots of working class votes. And Republicans in 2012 basically convinced themselves that they convinced themselves that Obama had come in and spent all this money, and there was going to be this massive repudiation of liberalism, and they were going to finally be able to do what Reagan and Nixon and George W. Bush hadn't done, and just cut the size of government finally. Don't just cut taxes, but really cut spending, really reform entitlements, really change Medicare, even Social Security. This was sort of the big Paul Ryan vision. Mitt Romney picked up on this. If you watch the 2012 Republican campaign, it basically is all pitched to entrepreneurs. They'd picked up on this line that Obama had where he said, "You didn't build that." The idea being that if you built a business, you probably had help from the government along the way, so you didn't do it alone. And so Romney and Ryan went around the country saying, "You built that," sort of basically talking to entrepreneurs, talking to small business owners, saying, "We're on your side, you're the real heroes of American life," and having nothing to say to the majority of Americans who don't own small businesses, who aren't entrepreneurs, who are wage earners and are on salary, and didn't see a lot for them in a Republican agenda that was just promising to cut Medicare and Social Security. And so Republicans convinced themselves that liberalism had overreached and they were going to come roaring back into power as this sort of pure Tea Party, limited government party, and instead they lost. And Obama was reelected, and Democrats held the Senate, and the Republican Party sort of fell into fighting this sort of long fight, kind of empty fight between its sort of establishment faction and its sort of Tea Party faction, both of whom more or less agreed on this kind of government cutting reform entitlements agenda, and just sort of disagreed on whether you could ever compromise with Democrats while doing it. So the Tea Party didn't want to compromise, and Mitch McConnell and the sort of leaders of the Republican Party did, but they were sort of still agreed on this basic small government agenda that was deeply unpopular, as it had been for 50 years with these working class voters who are incredibly important to a Republican majority. So I've been talking for 30 minutes and we've finally gotten to Donald Trump. So when Donald Trump starts running for president, he basically, out of some mix of intuition, cunning, genius, and dumb luck, figures out that the Republican Party's official debates are totally disconnected from a huge chunk of the Republican Party's voters. And those voters are primarily working class, and they don't care about Paul Ryan's blueprint for reforming Medicare. They care about the fact that, we've outsourced a lot of jobs to China, and their factory towns are hollowed out. They care about the fact that the opioid epidemic is getting worse and worse in Middle America, and nobody in Washington, D.C. or New York City seems to be paying any attention to it. They care about the fact that there's been this huge increase in immigration, and legal and illegal, over the last 30, 40 years, and American society has seemed to change in ways that are both disconcerting for sort of reasons of racial and ethnic chauvinism. People are sort of afraid that, that there's a kind of white identity politics, basically, that sort of develops in response to this demographic transformation, where people are sort of see white America as potentially oppressed or persecuted in a sort of majority-minority future. But there's also an economic component where people feel like just as jobs are being sent overseas to Chinese factories, they're also losing jobs to immigrant competition here. So those are the kind of issues that this chunk of the Republican coalition cared about, and nothing that at the elite level of the Republican Party, anyone was saying, was addressed to those voters. And those voters were also often totally disillusioned with the Iraq War and with the idea of an interventionist foreign policy. And the official Republican view was still that the Iraq War had been a good idea and had been a success, or would have been a success, if Barack Obama hadn't pulled troops out too soon, and so on, and that George W. Bush kept us safe after 9/11, and all of these sort of official Republican cliches that if you turned on the Republican debates in 2016, and for my sins and for my job, I watched every single one of those debates. I'm amazed my wife is still married to me after we had to sit through them. But if you watch those debates, again and again, you would see the men who thought they were going to be the Republican nominee for president, whether it was Jeb Bush initially or then Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz later on, making these sort of conventional Republican arguments, these Republican arguments that, go back to Ronald Reagan, and, often made sense given the economic landscape of 1979, but in 2016 just seemed sort of irrelevant. And then Donald Trump coming in and saying, well, why do we care about any of this? I'm going to bring back the jobs. I'm going to build the wall. I'm going to do all these things. And then Ted Cruz would say, you, sir, are no conservative. And Donald Trump would say, I don't need to be a conservative. I just need to do things that work. And that dynamic played itself out over and over again. And it played itself out on foreign policy, where, everyone in my profession thought Donald Trump lost the Republican nomination the night he started attacking George W. Bush. I think it was a South Carolina debate, and the Iraq War came up and 9/11, and, Jeb Bush, in sort of the swan song of his campaign, was standing up there saying, my brother kept us safe, and, this is just sort of a Republican cliche, right? And Trump said, what do you mean he kept us safe? 9/11 happened. He didn't keep us safe on 9/11. And the sort of journalistic reaction was, well, you can't say that in a Republican primary. Trump's never going to win. And, a week later, he won the South Carolina primary. Now, he didn't win the South Carolina primary with 50% of the vote, right? The secret of Trump's success was not that he took over the whole Republican coalition in the primary campaign. It was that he was really good at seeing this part of the Republican coalition that didn't believe in official conservative dogma, that felt like it had been losing out in economic policy, felt like it didn't recognize its country anymore socially, and wanted a champion. And Trump was there to be that champion, and that group within the Republican coalition, 25, 30, 35%, was enough to beat this divided field and get to a point where it was just him and Ted Cruz, and every Republican in Washington hated Ted Cruz, and so they weren't willing to unite around him. And again, all those of us who thought, well, the party will decide and the party will unite around a non-Trump candidate, we were all proven wrong, and Trump won the Republican nomination. And so then you move to the general election campaign, right? And what was true in the Republican primary had an analog in the general election, right? So there was a piece of the Republican coalition that was ripe for the plucking by Trump, and then there was a big chunk of independent voters, or not even independent voters, voters who had voted for Barack Obama twice, in 2008 and 2012, or voters who had stayed home in 2012 because they didn't like Obama, but they felt like Romney was just a rich businessman who was going to, eviscerate their companies and ship their jobs overseas. Those voters, especially in Midwestern states, were ready for what Trump was selling. And again, Trump was not selling the conventional Republican message on economic policy. He was not selling free trade, he was selling tariffs. He was not selling small government, he was promising that his health care plan would be bigger and better than whatever the Democrats had to offer. He was going around to parts of the country that had lost jobs for decades and promising, without a real plan, but promising that he wasn't just going to give them, more welfare or job retraining or all of these things that just came across as sort of condescending or unreal. He was going to get the jobs back, and he was exactly the right guy to do it. And at the same time, this was combined with all the stuff about Trump that horrified people, right? I mean, Trump began his campaign for the Republican nomination by doubting whether Barack Obama was actually born in the United States, by being sort of the country's leading birther. And he continued his campaign in the primary season and the general election with a lot of what I think it's fair to call race baiting, basically, sort of picking out issues and places and controversies where, where he would sort of, use either Hispanics or African Americans as scapegoats in various ways, exaggerating crime rates in the inner cities, exaggerating the scale of voter fraud, exaggerating immigrant crime, all of these things that took legitimate issues and took them in a very racially charged and sometimes overtly racist direction. And then that was combined with just sort of the sheer Trumpiness of his ridiculous insult wars with people, his fights with Gold Star families, and all of the sort of absurd theater of the Trump campaign. And that side of Trump alienated a lot of Republican voters, but not the sort of working class part of the party. It alienated suburban, upper middle class, professional Republicans, the kind of people who would have been Republicans before the party started being a working class party, the kind of people whose families would have voted Republican going back to 1955 or something. And so Trump lost those voters, or he lost a chunk of them. And the theory of the Hillary Clinton campaign was that you could pick those voters up and win a landslide. But instead, Hillary picked up those voters while losing all these voters in the Midwest who had been Democratic voters, who were sort of the last. They weren't, some of them probably had been Reagan Democrats, but they had ended up as Democratic voters again, and then they swung to Trump, and they became Obama-Trump voters, this sort of political science defying category of people who voted twice for the first black president and then voted for Donald Trump. And it tells you something amazing about the complexity of American politics, that those are the voters who ultimately determined the 2016 election and made Donald Trump president. But he became president. Richard Nixon won 60%, 58%. Ronald Reagan won 58% in 1984. Donald Trump won 46% of the vote. He became president with a minority share of the popular vote, with a large electoral college margin built on incredibly narrow margins in all those Midwestern states. And what that reflected was a lot of deep changes in American life. But above all, the fact that the working class now is an incredibly pan-ethnic working class. And Trump's pitch, because it mixed racial and cultural and economic appeals, was really targeted to the white working class. And if you look at the breakdown, of Trump gets, if you just take Americans without college degrees as a category, Trump got 50% of those voters and versus 43% for Hillary. If you just take white Americans without college degrees, he got like 65 or 70%. So he's winning huge margins among the white working class and getting walloped among the black and Hispanic and Asian working class. So in order for sort of the Trump combination, this sort of economically populist conservatism, to create a real majority, which he doesn't actually have, in order for the Republican Party to keep the working class, basically, to come back to the title of this talk, it would need to figure out a way to have its populism not seem like racism and nativism to a lot of black and Hispanic voters. And as president, overall, Trump has gone in the opposite direction. So on the one hand, once he came into office, he ended up not doing a lot of, or partially doing a lot of the economically populist things that he promised. If you go back and watch when he comes out on election night and he's clearly stunned that he's won, the first thing he says is, and we're going to do a big infrastructure bill. We're going to fix our highways. We're going to build bridges, all this stuff that, he's a real estate guy. That's the kind of stuff he likes. That never really happened because Trump came in and didn't understand anything about Washington, is not incredibly interested in the details of public policy, I think it's fair to say, and just sort of let Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan decide what his agenda would be, and they weren't interested in an infrastructure bill, so it didn't happen. Trump promised, a big middle-class tax cut. Instead, he got a Republican tax cut tilted pretty heavily towards the rich, in which the middle class didn't get a lot. Trump promised, this big, beautiful Obamacare replacement. Instead, there was Republican health policy ideas it's not the Republican Party's strongest suit, and they tried to pass an Obamacare replacement and nobody liked it, and it didn't pass, and it made the party much more unpopular. So Trump didn't really do a lot of the economic populism that he promised. He did do some stuff with tariffs. He did actually mix it up with China in a trade war. And some of his immigration moves could be, you could argue, are sort of economically populist, because if you put restrictions on immigration, according to some arguments, you end up raising wages for native-born workers. So there was some populism there, but there was also a lot of the same old Republican agenda that these voters had rejected when they voted for Obama. And then at the same time, Trump has, you know, whether it's after the aftermath of the Charlottesville white supremacist marches, or just in the last few days, in the last days before the midterms, he's returned again and again to racially charged sort of white identity politics provocations to try and hold that part of his base together. So the thing, you know, the closing argument online ad that his White House is putting out is just, it's, you know, it's a web ad about a guy who crossed the border illegally and killed people, and it's, you know, it's a racist portrayal of Hispanic Americans. I think that is a fair way of describing it. You know, or something like the caravan of migrants coming towards the U.S., that is a totally legitimate border security issue. There's actually big problems with sort of people presenting themselves and making asylum claims in ways that have overstretched our immigration system. But Trump is responding to it by saying he's going to send, you know, 15,000 troops to the U.S.-Mexico border to deal with a caravan that's still 800 miles away. It's basically just theater and demagoguery. So that's been sort of the story of the Trump presidency, basically, sort of letting the economic populism slip through his fingers a bit while trying to keep the kind of racially charged white identity politics stuff to hold that part of his base. And my sense, and you can send me angry tweets if this is proven wrong next week, but my sense is that basically in a lot of the places in the Midwest where he won voters who had voted for Obama, those voters are going to drift back and vote for Democrats instead. And so a lot of Democratic Senate seats in states that Trump won have turned out to be safe for Democrats, and generally in places like Pennsylvania, where he won unexpectedly, a lot of those districts are swinging back towards Democrats. And the Republicans are going to hold the Senate, but only because the Senate map is very favorable to them this year, and they'll probably suffer losses down the road. So basically, Trump has sort of had a big opportunity in certain ways to make the Republican Party fully populist on economics in a way that it hadn't been before, and sort of build out from the 46% of the vote he won to make the Republican Party a sort of fully working class party in certain ways for the first time in modern history. And the choices that he's made, I think, are basically designed to just hold his 46% or maybe hold 42%, and not build outward and, you know, continue to govern as a kind of unpopular minority of the country president rather than a truly sort of realigning figure. But in Trump, I think you can see the outline of a Republican Party that basically would be a working class party in a way that the Democrats were in the 1930s and 1940s. And you can see something similar in a more full-fledged way in a lot of the populist parties in Europe. I think the likely future of the Republican Party is in some kind of economic populism and not in the kind of government cutting and limited government ideas that have officially defined the party, even if they haven't been put into practice for many years. So in that sense, I think that part of Trumpism is here to stay. But whether it's successful will depend in the end on whether that Republican Party, that kind of Trumpian conservatism, can convince working class Americans who aren't white that a vote for that kind of party isn't just a vote for white identity, white privilege, and so on. And right now, I think for black and Hispanic voters, that's how it looks. And to really get a kind of conservative populist realignment, that is what would have to change, and change somewhat dramatically. So I'm going to end there. Thank you all for listening. I hope this was somewhat illuminating and entertaining. And we're going to do questions, as many questions as we have time to take. But how are we, is there a mic, or should people? Okay, there's microphones at either side. Please.
There's microphones on either side of the stage over here, so if you have a question, you can just come over and ask our Mr. Dothit those questions.
Does this, yes, okay, so I can switch to this and be very casual and come out from behind the podium.
Okay. So, hi, I'm Rashida. I'm president of Black Student Union. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you for coming.
So, when you started talking about Donald Trump, I was like, write stuff down. My one and only question is, it's long, pretty much, but you mentioned race baiting. So, over the past month or so, there's been a heavy political brawl in the Black community about the movement Candace Owens calls Blexit. Are you?
Yep.
Yep. You're,
I'm very familiar with Candace Owens and Blexit.
Right.
Yes.
So, in your opinion, what's so appealing about the Republican Party now, and even Trump now? Because I saw a live feed when Black Republicans my age were going to the White House, and one said that I am a Trump supporter first, and then I'm a conservative Republican. So, like, what, in your opinion, is their way of saying, like, hey, this is okay, despite all his racial controversy,
right,
despite all his social controversy, and even sexual controversy?
That's a really good question. Do you guys know, do people know what Blexit is? For those of you who don't, this is connected to the Kanye West Trump supporter thing, which many of you have probably followed, but there's a woman named Candace Owens who's African American and a kind of, activist, cable news talking head, conservative Trump supporter, or she's decided to be a conservative Trump supporter, and she has sort of organized a sort of a movement that claims to represent Black people leaving the Democratic Party, right? So instead of Brexit in England, it's Black exit Blexit, and Trump invited a bunch of those figures to the White House and so on. So what I mean. I think Candace Owens is kind of just a grifter who's, saw an opportunity to make a name for herself. But I think she is tapping into something real, which is that the odd thing about American politics is that if you look at the Democratic Party and you say, who are the most reliable Democratic voters, it's African Americans, right? Both in terms of how much they vote for Democrats, 85, 90, 95%, and also how dramatically they turn out. Yet at the same time, so at the same time, if you go by ideology, if you ask people, are you a liberal, are you a conservative, are you a moderate, and so on, African Americans are actually the most conservative part of the Democratic coalition on a lot. They include African American voters who vote for Democrats include a lot of people who describe themselves as conservatives. Sometimes socially or culturally because they're religious, sometimes economically because they, are small businessmen or something. So there's this big part of the Black community. It's not like 70%, but let's say it's 30% or something. That if race wasn't part of the picture, it would seem like natural conservative and Republican voters. But at the same time, race obviously is very much part of the picture. And those voters, I think generally for understandable reasons, see the Republican Party as a party that isn't that interested in their votes, doesn't really necessarily want them to vote in large numbers, and would happily pass voter ID laws that have a larger impact on minorities than whites, and is a place that sort of, Republicans who, want to insist that basically that, Democrats are the real racists or racism is a fiction, all of these kind of things. And so there's a sense in which there are Black voters who could be Republicans but look at the Republican Party and say this party is just a sort of vehicle for white interests that doesn't, doesn't care enough about me. But that dynamic then creates a lot of discontent, I think. Anytime it means that African Americans are often taken for granted by the Democrats. It means that you have especially more conservative African Americans, especially like religious African Americans who are out of step with what is often a very secular Democratic Party leadership. And in internal Democratic politics, I think that manifests itself more and more in younger black candidates doing very well because they're seen as sort of ways for black Americans to sort of take control of the Democratic Party. Someone like the nominee for governor in this very state, right, I think is a good example of that. But I think among the kind of people who get excited about Kanye or about Blexit, that there's, you know, this chunk of black America that just feels taken for granted by the Democrats and likes the idea of being courted by Republicans. And there's a part of Trump that gets that. This is why Trump is such a funny figure, right? The Trump on The Apprentice was incredibly popular with Hispanics and African Americans. And Trump had, you know, in that phase of his public persona, he wasn't seen as a racially polarizing figure. And he made, I think, a kind of calculated political decision when he decided to run for the Republican nomination to say, look, there's, you know, this group of voters who I can just lock in if I identify as a birther, right? And so I'm going to do that. And there's a group of voters I can lock in if I'm willing to be, you know, the toughest guy on illegal immigration and talk about rapists and criminals crossing the border and all the rest. And in doing that, he basically defined himself as a racially polarizing figure. But there's still a side of him that sort of sees this opening, this sort of weariness among African Americans and Hispanics with just being taken for granted in the Democratic coalition and wants to go do outreach. It's just that the rest of his strategy is, you know, running ads trying to scare white voters. So, you know, the interesting thing about Trump in 2016 was that there was this assumption that he was just going to get that he was just going to get completely demolished among African Americans and Hispanics. And he did lose African Americans and Hispanics, as Republican candidates always do, but he did a tiny bit better than Romney, especially among younger black men. And he did about the same as Romney among Hispanics. So there was no, he didn't actually pay the kind of price with minority voters that a lot of people expected him to, even as he did, of course, lose them. Sorry? Yes, absolutely. I apologize. I tend to rattle on. Anyway, thank you for your question.
On this
It's
side.
just a very rich subject.
On this side, sir.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Hi, Mr. Dothat. I've followed your career. I read a lot on the internet. When you're a blogger at the National Review, a writer at the National Review, I think it's safe to say that you are a member of the political right. Your politics are right-leaning. Is that right?
That's fair to say, yes.
Okay. Well, I'm very much a political leftist. I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, who I think would have beaten Donald Trump in 2016, but he didn't. But Donald Trump carried Republicans really to a big victory in 2016. I have two questions for you. Number one, what do you think is the biggest advantage that people on the right in this country have over people of the left? And number two, being an intellectual, which I think you are, and a member of the right, when does it get to the point that people such as yourself have got to say, look, I can't have anything to do with Donald Trump or his supporters. I think he's crossed the line into bigotry, hostility, and sometimes outright even advocating sometimes violence. When does it get to the point that people like you have to say, no more, I can't have anything to do with this? Thank you.
Sure. Those are both good questions. I mean, there are a lot of ways to answer the first one. I think the core advantage, in a certain way, that people on the right tend to have is a kind of comfort with, I mean, there's a crude way to say it, but a kind of comfort with America, right? That, you know, much of the political left exists in a much more sort of critical and distanced relationship with America, the Western tradition, all of these kind of things. And there are totally reasonable points embodied in that critique, but if you're just talking about sort of normal partisan politics, this kind of comfort, this sense that, like, you know, America is basically a good country, our history is basically a positive thing, all that kind of stuff, places, or has placed, at least for a long time, conservatives sort of closer to the core of American politics. And the Democrats have ended up sort of cobbling together a kind of coalition of very, you know, sort of disparate groups, basically. The Democrats are managed to be the party of the intelligentsia and academia, and also of recent immigrants. And go ahead, sorry.
Right, you're talking about voters voting to keep things the way that they are and stay in their comfort zones and not wanting to think differently and not wanting to...
Well, that's the left-wing way of putting it, yes.
Right? Yeah, if I can expand on that, it's like, if you ask, quote, conservative Republicans why they continually vote like that, they'll say, I keep hearing this, and especially on talk radio, it's like, they feel, I don't recognize this country anymore. This is not the country I grew up in.
Right.
It's not the country I wanted to be. That's a common thing on, yeah.
Well, but, and so, I mean, there are different ways that manifests itself, right? So there's a version of that that is sort of chauvinistic, that's basically sort of says, you know, the country, we have more Hispanics or Latinos in this country, and I don't recognize that, and so on, right? That's sort of the, you know, the potentially racist side of that. But there's another side of it that's like, you know, America in 1960, you know, 10% of children, 5% of children were born out of wedlock. Today, 40% are born out of wedlock. America in 1950 or 1960 had incredibly high rates of civic engagement and religious participation and all of these things that sort of go into social capital, right? And today it doesn't. We're a much more alienated and atomized and sort of hyper-individualistic society. So there are a lot of forms, basically there are forms of cultural conservatism that are just racism or chauvinism, but there are also forms of cultural conservatism, and I'm saying this as a cultural conservative, so take it with a grain of salt, that are right? That there were things about American society, everyday American life, that were better in the past and are better in many cases. But this is also, we're going to have to switch to another question in just a second, but this is also part of what Trump did, though, right? What Trump did that was different. Republicans were very comfortable with a sort of like America's great kind of argument. And Trump, part of his success was going into communities where the marriage rate had collapsed, where the opioid epidemic had hit, where jobs had gone away. He was more successful than other Republicans because he was less conservative and more willing to say, actually, this sucks. We need to make America great again. And so that's, you know, there's that complexity there. And I haven't answered your second question, but I bet I can work it into another answer. So go ahead, sir.
First of all, thank you for being here tonight. I apologize that more of the student body's not here, but if it makes you feel any better, there was a philosophy class. They were bribing kids with pizza to come in, and they don't think they even got half as many as they're here tonight. But thank you, Dr. Renz. Appreciate, I think this type of civil discourse is so very important. I'm a student here. I think one of the oldest students in the class I took. I studied in Europe, and I moved back to America. And I'm really worried about our country. I was in the Soviet Union when Gorbachev was there, and I watched a lot of really bad things. I was in Yugoslavia before the war started, and I was in Europe when the wall came down. And I was very grateful to come back to our country. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Green Party activist. I don't follow Bernie Sanders. I swing on my own hinge. I'm an American individual. And what concerns me most, and I really like to get your take on it, what concerns me most is the amount of dirt throwing, mudslinging, identity politics I hear from all the parties. This seductive way that Americans are spoken to, and politicians from all of these parties are trying to seduce us by telling us what we want to hear, and we pay with our votes. Do you think we can survive as a country with so much enmity being promoted by the media and all political parties? Do you think most Americans realize what danger we're in?
So because I'm a conservative, I'm temperamentally pessimistic, but I'm going to try and be optimistic because I think it's helpful in what is, I agree, a very sort of polarized and often depressing time. So when I spend a lot of my time on Twitter because that's where journalists hang out. And if you go on Twitter, you would think we were Yugoslavia in the 1990s. You would think we were Weimar Germany. You would think it was 1968 and there was going to be protests in the streets and riots everywhere. And then you put down your phone, close your laptop, get in your car, go out to, basically anywhere. And as long as people aren't watching MSNBC or Fox News, they don't seem like they're ready to kill each other, to me. And that, I could be wrong, and, history can accelerate suddenly. Like, lots of people thought Yugoslavia was this harmonious, multi-ethnic society, and then communism went away, and it was like, actually, no, we want to kill each other again, right? So, obviously, things can happen quickly in ways you don't expect. But my sense of the Trump era is that there is this big gap between the world as it exists on social media and cable news and the world as lots and lots of Americans who don't have to write about this stuff for a living experience it. And I think this is borne out in opinion polls too. Like if you look at there are these hard cores of committed partisans, but then lots and lots of Americans are, the reason I like to harp on the Obama-Trump voter is that the Obama-Trump voter, even if you hate Donald Trump, is kind of a sign of hope. It's like, if Americans can be like, hey, I'm going to vote for the first black president over here, and I'm going to vote for this crazy businessman from New York over there, then they aren't just locked into these tribes, right? They aren't just locked in the way you get locked in if you watch cable TV all the time. And the audience for Fox and CNN and MSNBC is not America. It's this, 500,000, 2 million, it's this sort of core of people, and they're setting the tone for our politics, and that's bad. And there are scenarios where that kind of core is what creates a civil war and civil breakdown. But we aren't yet at a point where, as nightmarish as the last week or so was, with the synagogue killing and the pipe bombs and everything else, if you go back to the period from 1968 to 1972 and look at, how many just random bombings there were, anti-Vietnam War bombing, white supremacist bombing, far left terrorism, all this stuff in America, and compare it to today, we are a much more, even in the age of Trump and chaos, we're a much more stable and peaceful society. And, and we got through the 60s, maybe by the skin of our teeth, but we did get through the 60s. And I think that my fear about America often is more that we're sort of stagnant and decadent and we're sort of aging, and I think it's really depressing that the birth rate has gone down even as the economy has recovered from the Great Recession. That to me is that's my deeper anxiety, that we're sort of isolating ourselves with our screens and we aren't forming families and having children and doing the kinds of things that make the future of the human race. So I'm pessimistic about that, but there's a sense in which the polarization still feels like a game of let's pretend and a sort of game of hysteria to me, more than Germany 1932 or even America 1968. So to the extent that I can give you some optimism, that's what I'm going to give you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Back on this side.
Hey, as somebody that kind of through his teenage years went through the Glenn Beck and the Bill O'Reilly and the Fox News household, back when those are mostly kind of Bush-era supporters, and then seeing this kind of drumming up support, and it sort of turned into a almost fear-mongering base that has, as you spoke about in your lecture, has created this sort of tribalism between that somebody else has spoke about as well. How do politicians that you mentioned that perhaps in the 50s used to vote for Republicans, that were the educated upper class, that have kind of pushed away from Trump, but are very much found in the Marco Rubios or the Ben Sasses or the Jeff Flakes, right, that pay a lot of mouth service to a lot of the anti-populism or a lot of the anti-nationalism, but they've already lost the Trump voters? Where do they find themselves? Because you take a look at Facebook or Twitter and you see them get absolutely lambasted by Trump supporters like Mitt Romney or Marco Rubio or Jeff Flake, because they've already been labeled or demonized as Little Marco or as Mitt Romney, whatever it may be. And yet because their political beliefs and ideologies don't line up with liberals and with Democrats, they've lost that base as well. So whenever I see this Team Red and Team Blue, I'm seeing this like old guard Republican club of Marco Rubios and Ben Sasses and Jeff Flakes that pay a lot of mouth service. But where do they end up in 5 years, in 8 years? Because I don't currently see a future for them when it comes to the political activism that I'm seeing and the big support. I mean, you don't see somebody running around these days saying that they're a big Marco Rubio supporter or a big Jeff Flake supporter. There's no Make Marco Happen Again hats, and there's, I just think it's kind of odd that they've lost both the liberal side, but then they don't have that strong base to kind of bring them up. Are we going to see a division in the future of the Republican Party with the educated, more rich business class and the kind of a little bit socially moderate, and then we're going to have perhaps a populist Republican Party, a little bit more nationalist? And where do you see that going in the future?
So I'll give you two scenarios. That's a really good question. So in one scenario, the Republican Party just sort of stays with the current Trump combination, which is sort of a pretty empty policy agenda, a lot of, NFL flag type, kneeling for the flag type controversies, and a certain amount of favoring business interests that sort of keeps the party funded. And in that scenario, basically the Republicans you're talking about, if they're comfortable with social liberalism, they'll become centrist Democrats. Not Flake per se, but like that kind of person. If you're sort of a moderate suburban business-friendly Republican, you'll end up sort of in whatever the future centrist wing of the Democratic Party is. If you're more socially conservative, if you're pro-life, if you're if basically you're uncomfortable with the Democratic Party on abortion, its attitude towards religious liberty, all of those kinds of things, then you'll end up sort of politically homeless, and you'll have this sort of group of mostly religious conservatives who vote for Republicans like half the time and stay home half the time, and are about and are kind of a small chunk of America. But you would see this with like younger evangelicals, right? I think the sort of younger evangelicals who don't like Trump, don't feel like they can vote for Democrats, and sort of you could see them drifting away from politics entirely. So that's one scenario. The other scenario, which I think is the better scenario, is a world where basically people in that group figure out how to speak to the legitimate concerns behind Trumpism while stiff-arming some of the bigotry and xenophobia, basically. And that's a hard challenge, but I think it's possible. I think that's what Rubio is trying. Rubio's approach under Trump has been very different from Flake's approach under Trump. Rubio is basically trying to sort of adapt some sort of Trumpian ideas on trade and economic policy and so on, while keeping, without going into like the kind of just full-throated opposition that Flake is in. And I think, I think Rubio's approach is right. I have a lot of doubts about whether he's the guy to implement it, because I feel like no Republican politician who was beaten by Trump in 2016 will ever lead the party, because the memory of that thumping is still too vivid. But that is, I think, the optimal scenario is basically for people who were establishment Republicans, who have reasonable moral objections to Trump, to still recognize that there's a reason why his economic populism resonated, that the sort of the free trade consensus that said, oh, we're just going to bring China into the world order and everything's going to be great, that was wrong. And it was bad for American foreign policy and bad for American workers, and China is becoming more authoritarian, not less. It didn't work. That was sort of what all the smart people thought we should do, and they were wrong. Needs to be able to recognize that, you know, Trump's border policies are too inhumane, but concern about mass immigration is a totally valid issue, and you can't have a Republican Party that's just always sort of going along with Democrats and trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform when that's not where the party's voters are. So I think there's a world where you could get a sort of, you know, and I think Rubio wants to get there, a world where those kind of people could still feel morally comfortable in the Republican Party by embracing a little more economic populism without, you know, going all the way to where Trump goes in terms of race baiting. But it's, and this sort of answers the earlier question about my own views, right? Like, that's sort of where I am. Like, that's what I want. I don't know if we're going to get it, but that's the kind of Republican Party that I would be comfortable supporting. A sort of a partially Trumpized party that isn't where Trump is on basically all his rhetoric related to race.
Thank you for coming out. A lot of what you've had to talk to us tonight about is just the central role that race has played in the rise of Donald Trump, and I think that's entirely fitting and appropriate. I don't think you could possibly overstate how much Trump's appeal has been built on white identity politics. That being said, I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates talking after he came out with that article, The First White President. He was on, he was talking to Chris Hayes on MSNBC, and at the end of the interview, he said, in all reality, like, if I had to pick one issue that I think is actually the most pressing, that will actually, like, matter the most in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, he says Donald Trump's going to come and go. But he said that he believed that, like, the environment and climate change is what, if he had his druthers, would be the central focus of what like people are talking about in public life. And my question is to you, if not climate change, if not the environment, if you had your druthers, what do you think would be the central focus? What do you think it will be most consequential? The thing that we did do now or that we didn't do that we will wish that we had addressed like a little more diligently?
Well, I guess I gave a slight version of this earlier, but I'll give the stronger version. This may not end up being as important as climate change, and when we're all, you know, wiped out, you can remember this and laugh at me and so on. But I think the fundamental, and this is not a problem that has a clear policy solution, but the fundamental problem in Western life, not just American life, but all developed societies, is a crisis of community, relationship, and meaning. And I think our politics, the extremism and polarization of our politics, is itself sort of an outgrowth of this, that people are looking to political tribalism to provide them with the meaning that family relationships, church attendance, all of these sort of basic sort of human connections that were part of American society throughout our history that's sort of slipped away. And I think the internet, I think cable news is worse than the internet, but I think the internet is accelerating this too. I think the fact that, you know, we're about to have the most gender polarized election in American history, right? If the Democrats win, it will be because they won women as never before, and if the Republicans win, it will be because they got a lot of, for instance, Hispanic men to vote for them in ways that people weren't expecting or something. And, you know, I completely understand why lots of women are voting against Donald Trump. But the underlying, like, gender polarization takes political divides that used to be along lines of race and class and takes them into, like, the most intimate human relationship, right? So you have men and women, the fundamental unit, not for everybody, but for most people, the fundamental unit of where you come from, who you live with, who you love, and so on. And you're introducing a deep political divide into that relationship. That's a bad sign, not for politics, but for society, for people, for men and women relating to each other, right? And men and women aren't relating to each other well. Me Too is sort of the most explicit manifestation of this, but men and women are not marrying, they're not they're not having children together. They're not forming relationships in the way that they did 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And this is, there's no, like, it's not like feminism did this or economic change did this or anything. Like, a million things did this, which is why there's no sort of obvious solution. But that, to me, is beneath the substrate of all these political divides, all these political controversies and arguments and so on, is that we're a society of people who have fewer siblings than they used to, who are less likely to be married than they used to, who are less likely to they still believe in God, but they're less likely to sort of participate in a community that's oriented towards the transcendent and the numinous. They're more likely to sort of pick up, like, something like Jordan Peterson, right? Like, so Jordan Peterson is offering an answer to this, in part, for young men, right? He's basically saying, you're alone, you don't know what you're doing, clean up your room and read these Bible stories and see this, read these myths and see these heroic archetypes and so on. And that's a positive thing, but it's also a limited thing. It's like you can't just get it from YouTube videos. You have to get it in a regular, you have to get it in relationships. You have to get it in communities and congregations and civic life and so on. And much of American life is like people sort of, Oprah plays a similar role, right? These sort of gurus who are on television or on the internet, and you get some of what you need from them, but not enough, I think. Anyway, that's a long enough answer, but thank you for a very good question. Yes, ma'am.
I don't really
Thank
have a
you for
question.
staying through my long-windedness, by the way. I appreciate it.
It was just I saw so many people starting to kind of get up, and I thought we're not going to have
I
time.
mean, I'm here for as long as you're here.
Okay. Mine is not a question, it's a statement. Okay, in 1964, my father passed away. He's buried in Arlington. I was only 12 years old. When we went to the hotel to try and get a room, my mom and I, there was bars on the window. The guy wouldn't let you into the lobby. And this is in 1964. Even up until a few years ago, you could go in any hotel, any time of the night, no problem. And I asked the young guy behind the counter, I said, why can't we come in and talk to you? And he says, because the crime rate is so high here, he says, we're liable to be mugged or shot. And he said, I advise you and your mother to get in your car and go somewhere out of Washington, D.C. to get a hotel. Okay. Then I was a mortgage processor for many, many years around this area. A lot of the banks don't even exist anymore. In 1990, not 90, but in the 90s, I applied for a position at a local bank, knew I was more than qualified, had 3 interviews, knew I was going to get the job, did not get the job. When I ran into the personnel manager in a grocery store one day, I asked her why I didn't get it. She said, honey, we had to hire a minority. Okay? We can figure out what the minority was. Just about 4 years ago, I went to a bank and said I would like to apply for a teller. It was a Wells Fargo bank, I'm going to tell you now. Talked to the manager, he looked over my resume, he says, well, you got to do it on the computer. He says, everything looks fine. He says, you've got a lot of experience, why would you want to be a teller? I said, well, I'm 67 years old. Mortgage processing, they want the young girls, they can hire them for a lot less than they can me. And he says, oh, do you speak a foreign language? I said, no. He says, it's going to be hard to become a teller here, hon. And I said, why? He said, because you don't speak Spanish. And he says, we're also looking for Arabic-speaking people. He knew I was more than qualified, but they wanted to hire somebody that could speak a foreign language, couldn't probably speak English that well. Okay? I am a Republican. I believe in standing for the flag. I believe in opening doors for people. My husband's in a wheelchair. I do not take the handicapped parking places if my husband's not with me or he's not going to get out of the car. I see people every day laughing and getting out of cars. They're taking the handicapped parking places when they're much more able than my husband is. I do believe in saying please and thank you. I do believe in God. And climate change, yeah, it's kind of funny, but if you read the Bible, it states it in there. So I just think, we need to turn around. And this thing about Republicans being so racist, who keeps saying this? It's the Democrats. Did anyone hear Hillary the other day on the talk show when the lady said, oh, well, you remember when Eric Clapton said we should kick him in the shins? Hillary said, no, it wasn't Eric Clapton, it was Eric Holder. But they all look alike, don't they? Now, Hillary said that. Now, why isn't that all over the news like if Trump said anything, it would be?
Should I answer the last question? Thank you.
Well, try.
I'll say two things.
These
Right.
are things that are not
So
being
one,
brought
I'm going to say one thing where I agree with you and one thing where I disagree with you a little. I think the stories that you told put together are a really good example of why a lot of liberals are wrong to just say, that arguments over race and arguments over identity and affirmative action and so on just reflect racism, because often they reflect this incredible tangle of, where it's, like you said, with the bank teller job, right? It's like, if the language, if the languages that are spoken in your area change, so does your employment possibilities. So does your comfort with everyday life in that environment. If you have racial quotas in hiring and minority set-asides and so on, that has an economic impact on middle-class white people who are, who don't see themselves reasonably as privileged. And one of the one of the things about the Trump era, right, is that, like, I do a podcast for the New York Times where I'm, on arguing with a couple of my fellow columnists. And one of the arguments we had last week was about, the question of, like, well, how do we think about, like, the gender divide and so on. And one of the arguments that you hear from liberals is like, well, the gender divide just reflects the fact that white men used to be privileged and now they aren't, and they're having a real tough time dealing with it. And that's true for some white men. There are a lot of very successful white men who are like, oh, Me Too is this, this terrible overreach and so on, and they're mostly just interested in protecting their privilege and position. But there are also an awful lot of white men for whom there's been nothing privileged about their lives in America over the last 40 or 50 years. And, if you're working in any kind of industrial occupation and, you're living in an environment where your father or your grandfather could expect a certain level of pay and the ability to support a family, and you're being asked to sort of, well, you need to retrain at 50 or something, like these kind of arguments that get made by nice, well-meaning, technocratic people. Those arguments just seem like a big middle finger, basically. Like, you worked your whole life and now you got to learn how to, you got to learn how to code. You're in West Virginia and you're going to learn how to code for the 21st century economy. That's not what people want to hear. It's not what they feel they've earned, and it doesn't map onto, the rhetoric that the left has leaned into of sort of constantly scrutinizing everybody's privilege just doesn't map onto the experience of lower middle class, white working class America, or big chunks of it, at least. And it doesn't mean that there isn't racism there, but it just means that the picture is a lot more complicated, and people have a lot of reasons for feeling discomfort with social change, with policies that are seen as sort of, advancing minorities and new arrivals at their expense. And all of that, I think, is something that, in analyzing the appeal of Donald Trump and the appeal of the Republican Party, liberals want to have to keep in mind. So thank you for what you had to say. I'm going to not argue with you, but just suggest at the end, one reason that when Hillary makes a bad joke on race and it doesn't get a lot of attention is that, Hillary isn't president. Hillary lost. Nobody on the Democratic side likes Hillary anymore. Not nobody, but mostly they want her to go away. And, like, when part of the problem in American society is that, like, if you watch, if you turn on Fox News and Sean Hannity, for instance, like, you would kind of think Hillary Clinton was still president of the United States. Was still president. She was never president, right? From the way that Hannity covers her, and the way that, when something comes out about Donald Trump, it's like, oh, he paid off a porn star a few weeks before the election, probably, and you turn on Fox, they're often covering Hillary rather than that. So I think that there does need to be, I talk to a lot of Trump supporters who have sort of convinced themselves that, Trump's reliance on bigotry or his dubious personal life or so on is just sort of either it's exaggerated by the media or everybody does it and things like that. And I think that's wrong. Like, I think Trump is, you know, he wants to play on racial divisions. He thinks that's a winning strategy. And the Democrats may want to do that too. You know, he may not be the only one, but that is a real part of his appeal. And people who support him do need to recognize that, I think. So I think that's a good place to end. Or no? Or,
All right, well,
yeah.
thank you very
All right.
much. All right, for everyone,
Thank
I know
you
some of
guys
you
so
had
much.
some questions that we were not able to get to. We are having a reception right next door at our C building and hope that you can join us. You'll have the opportunity to meet with Mr. Dothit. There are books that you can purchase and he can sign. For our students that are in the room, there are free books over there with your student ID. And by the way, we have free food, lots of it. So come on over and join us at the C building. Thank you.